I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome to the Vietnam Veterans News Podcast. News of interest about Vietnam veterans from a Vietnam veteran. Now, here's your host, Mac Payne.
This is Mac Payne here with episode 1737 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. News about the Vietnam War and the brave veterans who served there, as told to you by yours truly, a Vietnam veteran. In this episode, I'm going to tell you about another Vietnam veteran. His name is Bruce Frey, lives way up in the southeastern region of that beautiful state of Minnesota, specifically in St. Peter. St. Peter is about 80 miles southwest of Minneapolis-St. Paul, Minnesota. Now you know where Bruce Frey lives. Bruce Frey is another one of those people Americans should look at and say, thank God he is an American and he was willing to serve his country in the Vietnam War. He is just like many more of those outstanding representatives of the Vietnam veteran generation. They continued serving their country when they came home, despite the despicable welcome home they received from those uninformed, ignorant anti-war protesters. Recently, a story about Bruce Frey appeared in the Minnesota Legionnaire magazine. It was submitted by Tim Engstrom, and he did a great job writing this story. It was titled, From War Zone to Astronaut, Splashdown, St. Peter Sailor Frey Recounts Voyages of USS Arlington. That story also appeared in the St. Peter Herald, right there in Bruce's hometown of St. Peter. That story was so well written and so informative that I'm going to share it with you. It will show how Bruce and his fellow Vietnam veterans continued serving their country when they returned home, despite the rude reception they received from unknowing and misinformed anti-war protesters. They went on and continued serving their country in an outstanding manner because when they came home, they were older, wiser, tougher, and better able to deal with adversities than their non-Vietnam veteran contemporaries. Tim Engstrom's story is going to demonstrate that. Without any further ado, let's get into it so that you can enjoy the story about this Vietnam veteran. Again, the title is From War Zone to Astronaut Splashdown, St. Peter Sailor Frey Recounts Voyages of USS Arlington. Dateline, St. Peter, Minnesota. It was June 1967. Bruce Frey had graduated from St. Peter High School. His life was ahead of him. He and 5 of his buddies were having a beer and talking. As many were back in those days, it centered around join or get drafted. Hoping to stay together, they decided to join the Navy under the buddy system. He entered the delayed entry program in August and went to boot camp in January. He went from MEPS in Minneapolis to the Great Lakes Training Center, then to Camp Barry, where during processing, the people there found Frey needed glasses. That delayed him 2 weeks, and he was unable to remain with his pals. They found Frey had a skill. He could type 60 to 70 words per minute. That was always a priceless skill in the military. If you could type, you could avoid many of the other unpleasant duties that would be forced upon you. Frey was one of the lucky ones. After basic, he was sent home on a 2-week leave. Then he was sent to the 7th Fleet. It was based out of Long Beach, California, technically, but Frey said it never went there. Instead, the crews would rotate while the ships remained off the coast of Vietnam. Frey was on the USS Arlington AGMR-2, a light aircraft carrier that in 1965 had been converted into a major communications relay ship. It's funny how the military works. Speaking as a veteran, all I can say is, no kidding. He got there and there wasn't an opening in his military occupational specialty, so he became a gunner's mate while he waited. He maintained 3-inch 50 caliber and anti-aircraft guns, 2 aft and 2 fore, along with small arms such as M16s, 45 caliber pistols, M14s, Medusa 50 cals, riot shotguns, line shotguns, and even flares. He ended up being a gunner's mate the entire tour. In action. The Arlington operated at Yankee Station handling 7,000 messages a day and maintaining ground-to-air commo. Unlike most sailors, the ones on the Arlington could call home because it was one of the 2 ships with satellite commo. The other was the USS Annapolis AGMR-1. I would encourage you to go over to the podcast website, VietnamVeteranNews.com. Over there, not only is there a picture of Bruce Frey himself, there's also a picture of the USS Arlington underway in 1968. I have to admit, it's one of the strangest looking Navy ships I've ever seen, but it got the job done. Did the Arlington get attacked out there in the South China Sea's Gulf of Tonkin? Frey said the ship had some junks come after it. The brass sent smaller ships after them. Wonder whatever happened to those junks. In another case, an airplane buzzed them at night. The pilot demanded identification or risk of being fired upon. If you look at the ship, you would not think there was anything in the fleet that looked like that, Frey said. What's more, the ship typically operated in a hidden location, and in this instance was under orders to maintain radio silence. After firing a flare, they had to break the silence, but it was all a misunderstanding. The pilot was American. Frey said someone's butt was chewed out that night. The Arlington would take turns with the Annapolis at Yankee Station, staying online usually 30, 40, or 50 days. During the offline days, the ship's crew would get some R&R or perform repairs or other upkeep, usually at Subic Bay in the Philippines. They probably were well entertained at Subic Bay by all those bands that would come over to Vietnam and entertain the troops there. I'm sure they did a lot of entertaining there at Subic Bay. Moving on to the moon landing. Apollo 8 was shot around the moon without a landing. The Arlington headed to Hawaii to add another satellite dish. Then she went to the splashdown area to assist with the communication in recovering the astronauts. Then, of course, the Arlington headed back to Yankee Station to relieve the Annapolis. In May of 1969, the Arlington helped with the splashdown of Apollo 10, which did everything short of landing on the moon, and in July, Apollo 11, the first moon landing. President Richard Nixon stayed on the Arlington the night before the splashdown. The ship was in the national spotlight, and Frey saw Nixon but didn't talk to him. He wore lots of makeup, Frey said. All the ammo and small arms had to be locked below deck, and the main armorer slept inside with the weapons that night. They don't really think a sailor on the Arlington would have actually tried to do in the president, do they? I guess so. They had to lock up all the ammo and have the armorer sleep with it. The U.S. Arlington came back to the United States in September of 1969. We got word that we were no longer needed, that we were outdated, and they were decommissioning the ship, he said. Frey returned home just before Thanksgiving in November. The Arlington was decommissioned at San Diego in January 1970, mothballed until 1976 when she was sold for scrap to the National Steel and Shipbuilding Company, which towed her to Terminal Island in Los Angeles. The buyer was finished scrapping her in 1987. We went from highly sophisticated in 1966 to nothing in 1969, Frey said. In her time, the Arlington earned 7 campaign stars for Vietnam War service. Frey had another year to serve, and he was moved to the Naval Reserve. The Naval Reserve became the Navy Reserve in 2005. He had to travel to Bainbridge, Maryland, once a month, and he separated in the fall of 1970. Back to St. Peter. He joined the VFW like his father, then the Legion II. Eventually, the VFW in St. Peter folded. With the American Legion Post 37 in St. Peter, he was deeply involved in the steak fries for 16 years, and I bet they were good. He got into volunteering at the Legion to raise funds for a new roof. Frey went to a vocational school and pursued a career in sales and marketing. He tried to adjust swiftly to civilian life, though he sometimes found himself defending his military background during a divisive time in the 1970s. And I'll bet Bruce Frey stood up to those stupid anti-war protesters real good. He got married to his wife, Susan, and they had a daughter, Stacy. The same thing happened to him that happened with his Navy MOS. He ended up doing something else. He could not find any sales work, but he got a state job as a security counselor at the Minnesota Security Hospital in St. Peter. He did that for 30 years. He still teaches security classes for the hospital, often to contractors. Did you hear that? He worked there at that hospital for 30 years. You don't stay at one job for 30 years if you're not doing a good job. I'm sure Bruce Frey did a real good job there at the Minnesota Security Hospital, right there in St. Peter. He had known Susan from high school when he worked with her at the Red Owl grocery store. After the Navy, they connected at Sioux Trail Bowling in St. Peter. Their daughter lives in St. Peter with her husband, Wally. They have 2 children, a daughter and a son, both young adults. Now, isn't that nice? They all lived right there together in St. Peter, Minnesota. None of his children moved out to California or Colorado, and he would only see them every 2 or 3 years. Pardon me, but I do not want to be accused of bellyaching. Bruce Frey, you did good keeping your family right there in the same town. These days, Frank, who is a young 78, is active with the St. Peter area Vietnam Veterans Last Man Club. It began running the Last Man Club Golf Classic in the spring of 2016 at the Shoreland Country Club. Proceeds benefit the organization's Vietnam Relief Fund, which provides emergency assistance and unmet needs to local veterans, usually when no local, state, or federal aid exists. Doling out around $30,000, the fund has helped more than 40 vets. That is the story of Bruce Frey of St. Peter, Minnesota. That includes his service in Vietnam on the USS Arlington and what he did when he came home to St. Peter, Minnesota. Again, I say to you all, America is very fortunate to have Vietnam veterans like Bruce Frey living here. They are wonderful people, and they have spent the last 50 years verifying that fact. Bruce Frey, on behalf of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast, I am hereby issuing you a Vietnam Veteran News Podcast salute for your service to your country. Thank you very much. We wish you the best and encourage you to keep it up. That's my opinion, and I'm sticking to it. This is Mac Payne closing out episode 1737 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. Thank you so much for listening to these stories. You are cordially invited to return again soon and often to listen to more of them that will be coming your way on this podcast, the Vietnam Veteran News.
How about that? Ain't that a mess?